This is Mark Laux, Extension Weed Scientist with Ohio State University, and this is the Winter 2021 Herbicide and Weed Management Update from OSU Weed Science and for Pesticide Recertification. I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about our recent survey information because I think there's some good news here. The OSU Weed Science Group does a survey at the end of every growing season just prior to soybean harvest, and we typically hit about 50 counties. This year we had 47 counties and about 5,000 fields, and we do a transector across those counties, looking at weed populations in soybean fields to see what the level of intensity frequency and level of intensity is of several key weeds. The good news is we also make note of the number of weed-free fields, which has jumped up by about 25% this year. We're up at 74% of our fields weed-free, and then the numbers, obviously, for some of these weed, the infestation numbers are down. Giant ragweed down to 13%, mare's tail to 10%, common ragweed down to 0.9%. The weed that keeps going up over the past few years, even in response to adoption of new technology like Extend and Enlist and Liberty Link, which is driving down the populations of the other weeds due to some better options for control, is water hemp. Water hemp was up to 8% on average across our survey, but up to 31% in the west central part of the state. And obviously, the western part of half of the state is where we have generally more water hemp issues. We lump the two together, water hemp and pigweed, um, but still, it's a considerable number. And in west central Ohio, that does reflect a lot of water hemp. So if you look at our 2018 data, you can see we were 58% weed free. So there is a nice jump between 2018 and 2020. Giant ragweed and 20%, mare's tail and 15, which is still down for mare's tail over about the previous 5 years. Giant ragweed has stayed about 15 to 20 over the whole time we've been doing the survey, so it's nice to see it drop into 2020. And then you can see the water hemp was down at 5.7%, or the water hemp pigweed versus 8% in the 2020 survey. Our extension educators also do a survey for us. A different number participate every year. This year we had 26 counties and about 2,600 fields. Their numbers are typically a little bit more severe. They're not doing transects across entire counties. They're picking a stretch of road and doing 50 to 100 fields, so they tend to have some higher infestation levels. But still, they went up to 41% weed free in 2020, and giant ragweed at 20%, mare's tail 21%, common ragweed 5, and then water hemp at 11%, but up to 14 to 24% in the western part of the state. And if you look at their 2018 data, you can see they were down to 30% weed free, and then the numbers for the weeds were all higher in 2018, considerably higher, with the exception of water hemp, which was a little bit lower because water hemp is creeping up every year, and that's one of our major concerns. Switching gears to cover a few new herbicides, and these are all in the weed control guide. We still don't really have hardly any development of new active ingredients, and essentially we haven't seen any new development of new herbicide sites of action, but Reviton is one new active ingredient we have seen for 2020. Reviton is in the same chemical family as saflufenicil or sharpen, so it's a group 14 herbicides for burn down of weeds at planting or prior to planting. OSU, Purdue, and University of Illinois don't have any research experience with Reviton. We weren't given the opportunity to work with it, so we really don't have any way to evaluate it and give it ratings. We're assuming, because the rate's the same and the chemical family's the same, that it's probably similar in activity to sharpen, which means it would be needed to be mixed with something else like glyphosate or glufosinate to give a comprehensive burn down in whatever crop you use it in. It's labeled for no-till corn, soybeans, and wheat, although it has to be applied at least 14 days before soybean planting, which does give it some restrictive type of use. An active ingredient that's been available in other markets but not corn so far is Tough or Pyridate, which has a relatively limited spectrum of control, especially at the lower rates. Its site of action is it's a group 6 herbicide, a photosystem 2B inhibitor. So in some of the other crops that it's labeled in, at a relatively high cost at the higher rates, between 8 and 24 ounces, the higher rates do give decent control of some key weeds. When the rates lower to make it more affordable for use in corn to be competitive with the other herbicides we use, you really lose that, and so the spectrum of control is really fairly narrow and it doesn't control much. You can apply it up to the 8-leaf stage of corn, which gives it an advantage over something like atrazine the way that it's being marketed, which is using the 8-ounce rate to be mixed with HPPD inhibitors like mesotrione, Impact Lautus, and Shield X to improve control of certain weeds that are glyphosate resistant and glyphosate won't help on. For example, giant ragweed, common ragweed, and water hemp are several key weeds that it would help on. So it accomplishes the same thing as atrazine more or less, but it has much more flexibility in the timing in which you can use it. So if you look in the weed control guide for this, we don't have it alone. We don't have it rated alone. We just have it rated in combination with the HPPD inhibitor, sort of as a bulk kind of row in the table to show how it improves control of a couple weeds that they can be weak on. Elite 27 is a new name for a product we've been using in corn for a long time. Balance Pro, the active ingredient is isoxaflutol. And in corn, the Balance Pro has a safener in it as well. And it doesn't have the safener in it for soybeans. So the GT27 soybean and the LLGT27 soybean sold by some companies have resistance to isoxaflutol, which is Elite 27 or Balance. It's a Group 27 herbicide. We've used this herbicide for a long time, so we have a good handle on what it does. The rate's 1.5 to 3 ounces. It can go anytime before soybean emergence. So it controls a pretty broad range of broadleaf weeds and suppresses grasses. Typically, putting some metribuzin or something else with it would round out the control, at least somewhat. And if you're trying to get really upfront, very good grass control to start, you probably would have to have a grass herbicide with it. But one of the key features here is in especially non-GMO and Roundup Ready beans, when we have ALS resistant common and giant ragweed, we really don't have very many options for control. And in fact, we have no options for control of ALS resistant giant ragweed from a residual herbicide standpoint. And Elite 27 does provide some initial control of common and giant ragweed. I think we give it a 7 on common ragweed and maybe a 6 on giant. So some control up front, which we lack in a lot of giant ragweed populations at this time. And it also has some residual activity on burr cucumber. Aside from that, there's a lot of new premixes and Me Too premixes and generic products. So some of the common premixes that we use have been using for residual activity in both corn and soybeans are generic alternatives now. And of course, you can buy generic components and mix those sometimes at a cheaper, for less cost than you buy the premix. But we have combinations in soybeans, for example, of flumioxazin or sulfentrazone with metribuzin, clemuron, and mezenthapyr, which is pursued metolachlor. And we have various products, and there are new products that are set the same loading in some cases, or roughly the same ratio, or pretty close. We have post-emergence plus residual premixes, and a lot of this has been driven by the water hemp and Palmer amaranth market, where we need something that can knock down the emerged weeds post-emergence, and then also have a second component that gives some residual activity. So, for example, a lot of these are combinations of metolachlor, pyroxasulfone, which is Zidua, plus post-herbicides, and examples are Anthem Flex and Max, Warren Ultra, Perpetuate. Anthem Flex and Max are combinations of pyroxasulfone with Cadet or AIM, so you don't have a lot of knockdown activity of certain weeds, but you can mix something else with it to give you better control. Warren Ultra is a mix of acetochlor and Reflex, and then Perpetuate is Resource plus pyroxasulfone. So some good ways to get some residual and also some post activity. And then we have some other components or herbicides that do have components that, when you put the two together, can give you significantly better control of certain weeds. An example is Cynate, which is glufosinate or Liberty plus topramazone or Impact for corn with glufosinate resistance, Liberty Link corn. And you put the two together and you can really get some good control across the board. I think this herbicide probably gets almost a 9 rating on almost every weed. And then if you put it in a tough Palmer amaranth or water hemp situation, it's a combination that can give you better control, especially of large ones. One of the things about all the generics is it affects how we list them in the weed control guide. So in some cases, you may look for a certain trade name and the herbicide descriptions are on the table and not find it. And that's because that particular mix of components are several different trade names for it. And so we start to list it in the weed control guide by its common name. And the way to figure this out is any trade name that you have, you can always, if you can't find that trade name in the descriptions or the table, you can always go to the glossary in the back and look it up and see what the components are, and then go looking for the components. So, for example, here the Valor is listed as flumioxazin, and you can see some of the other herbicides that also are flumioxazin. And then you have the sulfentrazone, mezenthapyr, or Pursuit, which you can see second line there, the trade names for that. So you won't find it listed by trade name. You have to look for the common name, and then same thing on the table. But some products, but there's only one or two trade names for the same mix, we still list it by trade name. And then once we have more than two, we tend to list it by the common name. So that's just how you can figure that out. We have a lot of good soybean trait technology now, and it's still evolving. So you have a lot of choices. And as I mentioned earlier, we have especially some very good post-emergence options to control some of the weeds we've been struggling with and deal with some herbicide resistance issues. Obviously, we can still do non-GMO, and then we have Roundup Ready. Information I have is that companies are not emphasizing Roundup Ready, straight Roundup Ready, as much because they're selling some of the more advanced platforms, but you can still find those. And then for some of those varieties, you can keep the seed from year to year now. The disadvantage is it can be difficult to control some of the resistant weeds with just glyphosate or glyphosate plus PPO inhibitors. Liberty Link, of course, and you have various glufosinate products you can use. A number of companies are selling those under different names. They all have about the same loading, but there are some differences in surfactant packages, and you can occasionally pick up some differences among product effectiveness based on that, but it's been hard for us to do that consistently in our research. The LibertyLink GT27, which is the stack of glyphosate, glufosinate, and then the isoxaflutol that I just talked about. So here, if you wanted to use isoxaflutol, this is a bean you can use that on, and then you can tank mix glyphosate and glufosinate to pick up broadleaves and herbicide-resistant weeds and also grasses if you need to do that. And then you have the Extend and the Enlist platforms. So Extend started as Roundup Ready Extend, glyphosate, and dicamba resistance, and you can see the dicamba products that just did get their labels renewed. Extendamax and Ingenia, and apparently Fexapan will get its label back here at some point. And then Tavium, which is a mix of essentially Extendamax with metolachlor to give you some residual activity. So those are the only products labeled for pre and post emergence use in this bean. That's evolving to the Extendiflex, which is glyphosate plus dicamba plus glufosinate or Liberty resistance, which is available now, but not across the entire product line. And our assumption is that that product line will evolve to all be Extendiflex. And then Enlist E3, which is the stack of glyphosate and glufosinate, and then 2,4-D-choline. 2,4-D-choline is the formulation that Dow developed, now being sold by Corteva, that had reduced volatility issues, and that's sold as Enlist 1, the straight 2,4-D, and Enlist 2.0 is the 2,4-D plus glyphosate. And then you have, apparently, the rumor is an E4, an Enlist E4 coming, which is glyphosate plus glufosinate plus the 2,4-D-choline plus isoxaflutol. So the Elite 27 would be able to be used on that as well. If you look at these two, these are very broad spectrum platforms, especially with the addition of the glufosinate to the Extend. The difference is the key difference probably is still the volatility and off-target movement issues with the Extend and Extendiflex, which have not really been completely resolved by the new label and some of the requirements, which we'll go through here in a minute. So in sensitive situations, there are places where it's still going to be difficult to use Extendiflex. In contrast, the 2,4-D so far really hasn't moved around. Meetings that I have with my peers across the Midwest, everybody's basically saying that there don't seem to be off-target movements with the 2,4-D-choline. That doesn't mean it can't drift and cause certain issues, but there does not seem to be a volatility component. And then also, non-enlist soybeans are just much more tolerant of 2,4-D than non-extend beans are to dicamba. So it takes very little dicamba to cause symptoms on non-extend soybeans, and it takes a lot of 2,4-D to cause symptomology and yield loss on a non-enlist bean. Some of the new label things for Extendamax and Ingenia, which also will apply to Fexapan, and then these apply to Tavium as well. Most of the restrictions on where you can use it and how. And so they've limited, the EPA here has limited the maximum rate per application. So it used to be, for example, for Extendamax, you could go up to 44 ounces per application, and now it's down at 22. And similarly for Ingenia, you can go to a maximum of 12.8 ounce per application. So some of the big weed situations and big burn down situations, you may have to mix something else with it to make it work rather than just bumping up the rate. You still can do a maximum of 2 pre and 2 post applications, and you can still go up to a maximum of 88 ounces of Extendamax for the season and a maximum of 51 for Ingenia. Extendamax can go up to R1 and no later than June 30th. So if you hit R1 before June 30th, you're done. If you don't, you can go to June 30th. Ingenia, there's no growth stage restriction. It's just no later than June 30th. Tavium, because it has a metolachlor in it, it's up to V4 and no later than June 30th. XtendiMax has to include a volatility reducing agent, VRA, such as a Vapor Grip Extra Agent product. In Genia, they call it an approved pH buffering adjuvant, trying to make sure the pH doesn't drop so much that it increases the volatility of the dicamba. And on the websites for these products, you can see the approved products to add to accomplish this goal and that meet those specifications. Still can't add AMS. Apply between 1 hour after sunrise and 2 hours before sunset. Wind at boom height between 3 and 10 miles per hour. Like most herbicides, don't apply during a temperature inversion and boom no higher than 24 inches above target. Probably the two biggest things here are the having to maintain a 240-foot buffer between the last treated row and the downwind edge of the field, which means you have a 240-foot area that you would have to treat with other herbicides post-emergence if you had been planning to use dicamba in the rest of the field. But roads, mowed grass, and tolerant crops can be included in the buffer. So if you have corn downwind or another extended soybean field downwind, that counts. But that can be something that can be a little difficult to deal with. Still no application of sensitive crops or certain plants endangered or in adjacent downwind field. And then they've changed the wording a little bit on runoff. So label states don't apply when current conditions favor runoff of water from the field or the soil is saturated with water, or rainfall is forecast that may cause runoff to occur within 48 hours after application. And the label still requires the stewardship training every year, the dicamba training, and for growers to be aware of all this and implement all these precautions. Enlist generally, I'm not going to list them all here. Enlist has some parameters in terms of buffers and things like that, but they're not near as restrictive. One of the issues with Enlist has been apparently some tank mix problems with compatibility and gunking up sprayers, and so they have a very specific set of tank mix sequence procedures they want you to use, so make sure you're aware of those from your dealer or the website or wherever. Among these is to allow any AMS product to mix for 5 minutes before adding anything else, and that liquid AMS is just far less problematic than dry. Last year there weren't many dry AMS products approved for use with Enlist, but maybe that's changed coming into 2021. Both dicamba and 2,4-D can antagonize post-grass herbicides. It shows up on volunteer corn specifically, but it can show up on other grasses, and this has been an issue, I know, further south in places like Tennessee, especially as they've started to develop also some reduced activity of glyphosate on the grasses down there. So the recommendation for Enlist is increase the grass herbicide rate by 1/3 and make sure you're using adjuvants that are recommended for the grass herbicide. For example, if you're using a generic clethodim product, that would call for the use of crop oil concentrate, and then you have to make sure that that is actually approved for use if you're keeping the Enlist in the mix as well. So you have to make sure everything's approved and then try to optimize the grass herbicide. There are a lot of different reasons that growers choose seed, company loyalty, performance, disease resistance, any number of these. Once you get past all that, certainly when you're trying to choose among these systems, we always focus on these key weeds because they're the ones we've just had most problems with in a non-GMO and a Roundup Ready system. So, I mean, if you're just not really struggling with any of these, maybe you just have a little bit of mare's tail and your giant ragweeds under control, you may still be able to go with a Roundup Ready or a non-GMO system, and certainly a Liberty Link is going to work fine for you. You just start to get into more substantial water hemp, palmer amaranth issues, or you're just really struggling with some of these other weeds. One of the more aggressive systems where you have the option for multiple post herbicides, in some cases that you can mix together, may be a better fit. There's various ways that I could present this. This is the way that I do, and I don't think it's necessarily the most straightforward way to present this, but this table assumes that you have glyphosate and ALS resistance in all these weeds. And so when you look at a non-GMO or a Roundup Ready program, you're going to be relying on post-application of PPO inhibitors like Cobra and Flexstar to help you out. And so that's why when you look at the far right, when you see common ragweed and water hemp and palmer, once they develop PPO resistance in addition to the ALS and glyphosate, you can't control them in non-GMO and Roundup Ready beans, so you end up with poor control in that system. If you don't have that type of resistance, you can still in some cases get by and get good control. You're relying on Flexstar and Cobra to help you out for giant ragweed, but we haven't developed resistance to that yet. And then mare's tail you can handle with a combination of fall burn down plus spring residual burn down. And if you use the right residual, you really can hold it pretty well and don't need a post option. But we give them good ratings just because it's just more difficult to do that. And good can be optimistic at times versus the other systems where you just have very effective post herbicides to control these weeds. And we rate them essentially all excellent for mare's tail, giant rag, and common ragweed. The difference being for Enlist, the system for Enlist, regardless of what burn down you use, even if you use 2,4-D, which doesn't solve our 2,4-D burn down issues with mare's tail that we've consistently had in the absence of a fall application. But if you use the whole Enlist system where you do 2,4-D pre and then come back with Enlist or Enlist-O or some Liberty post, you really do get excellent control. But it's just the butt just indicates that the burn down, the ability to use 2,4-D at higher rates doesn't really solve the burn down issue with mare's tail. Whereas dicamba and the extended flex really is a consistently more effective burn down herbicide for mare's tail. If you go to water hemp and palmer, you start to see some differences there. And the main thing is really in the extended-flex and Enlist, you have the option to use a couple different non-glyphosate herbicides. In Enlist, you can mix 2,4-D and glufosinate or Liberty if you need to. At extended-flex, we're not really sure if you'd be able to mix the glufosinate with a dicamba and still meet the application parameters and the stewardship guidelines for the dicamba, but you certainly would have the option to use dicamba and then come back with glufosinate if you need to. So you do see the advantage there over the Liberty Link or the just plain Extend or Liberty Link GT27, which still can work. It's just a matter of which one can give you more consistently effective control. We're still very concerned about Palmer amaranth and water hemp. Palmer amaranth we've detected probably in about 30 counties now, but it's been eradicated in a lot of those counties, and we still just have a few places where it's really gotten established in fields, and we've had to deal with it and have a consistent program for management of it going forward from year to year. As I said, water hemp is a bigger concern. It's spreading through the state at a pretty rapid rate, and our management learning curve probably isn't keeping up with it well enough. It does require a different management than giant ragweed and mare's tail. And it does require, in a lot of cases, use of the new platforms. So people that are still using non-GMO Roundup Ready, in some cases even Liberty Link, and don't have the right program that are struggling with it, and then it's just a difficult to control weed, period. Make sure you're up to date and up to speed on how to identify the pigweeds. We have a video for you on our YouTube page. We have a fact sheet on our website, which is u.osu.edu/OSU weeds. And if you ever have any questions about ID, which typically for us occur a lot in mid to late season when it starts to become evident that it's come through herbicide programs and poking above the beans, don't ever hesitate to contact us. One of the things about both these weeds is if you can do anything you can to keep them out of your operation, it's going to be a good thing. That would increase your management costs. They produce a lot of seed. They have been cycling through developing different types of resistance, and we're starting to pick up that we're developing, in some cases, possibly 3 to 6 way resistance in populations here in Ohio. And so, the combination of the difficulty to control it and the fact that it produces a lot of seed means you can have something that gets out of hand very fast. So we're still saying make sure you monitor fields in mid to late season, rogue plants to try to prevent them from going to seed so you don't get into a mess over a couple year period. We've seen plenty of cases where by the time we got there, the field was a mess, and we've had the comment a few times we didn't have this weed last year, or we didn't have very much of it, and this just shows how fast it can take over a field. And again, this is because of the seed production. These are both plants, Palmer amaranth and water hemp, that can produce upwards of 1 million seeds per plant. They tend to not have a lot of dormancy and be active and ready to go immediately into the next year, so they can ramp up populations pretty fast. Conversely, we also lose about 80% of the viability over the first winter, and then it tapers off to about only 5% viable over the next couple of years. So that is the good news. And if you get into a situation where you have some, it can get very controlled for several years. You can drive the population back down. Key steps to keeping them out. Our thinking is in a lot of cases, the first time you're going to see it's probably going to be mid to late season when it pokes above beans. You probably won't see it in corn until you're harvesting. In a lot of cases, make sure you use residual herbicides in corn and soybeans. They're a first line of defense. Try to keep it out for the first part of the season so you don't have full season plants going to seed. Know what it looks like. Spend some extra time going around and across your fields, possibly in late July into early September, looking for water hemp and palmer, especially if you're in an area that has some already established, or if you have areas of fields that flood and things like that. Get help with ID if you need to. If it doesn't have mature seed, and we have a video on our YouTube page on how to figure out if it has mature seed, just pull it up, chop it off at the soil line, get it out of the field. If it does, you might want to bag it up or be a little more careful. And then if the first time you see it is when you're on a combine. We've seen a lot of spread of these weeds from field to field via combines, where we can see where the combine pulled into the next field and started up and blew that seed out and started an infestation there. So you may want to debate whether you run your combine through areas infested with this, or maybe run through last and then come back and clean the combine out. And this is all part of our No Pigweed Left Behind program, where we're trying to get everybody to think about preventing the establishment of water hemp and palmer amaranth, and then also, even if you're dealing with it, making sure you're going out and pulling the last few plants that escaped because they might be resistant, and they're just going to be something that perpetuates populations into the next few years. Reminders about control programs for water hemp and palmer. You will need residual herbicides up front. They're not typically burn down weeds because they come up in May, but it's possible they are. Most of our common burn down herbicide programs, multi-herbicide programs, will handle it. We have ratings for this in the weed control guide. You have ALS resistance and some PPO resistance. And so the ALS resistance means products like Climburon and Clarencelam, First Rate, and Pursuit won't give you any control. The PPO resistance doesn't remove the ability of Valor and Authority to control them, but it shortens the length of residual, so you'll still get some upfront control. Your strongest pre-emergent start is with a premix or a tank mix that includes 2 non-ALS herbicides that work on it. So, for example, in Fierce you have Valor and pyroxasulfone. In Trivence you have metribuzin and flumioxazin or Valor. You have products like Boundary that have dual and metribuzin in it and the like. So if you have a couple different herbicides in there that work on it, it'll probably last a little bit longer if that's what your goal is. If you go back to just one non-ALS product, it's probably going to run out a little bit faster. That doesn't mean it's not a bad start. And if your plan is to come back and add a residual herbicide like Dual or Zidua to your post program, you may want to err on the side of using a less aggressive pre-emergence program at the time of planning and coming back with those products post-emergence. And so one of the adaptations to weed control programs that has been made, and this is really the first time we've had to do this for weed control in Ohio, is adding one of the post-Site 15 herbicides to one of the residual post-Site 15 herbicides to post programs, so that the post herbicide knocks down the water hemp or palmer, and then you get residual control from the other one. Pyroxasulfone or Zidua is the most effective of these consistently across university trials. You can get it by itself as Zidua. You have various premixes that you can get it in, Anthem Max, Perpetuo, and some other ones. You can mix Dual 2 Magnum or generic metallochlor with your post. It's a little bit less effective, and then effectiveness drops off more to acetochlor and dimethenamide, which are Outlook and Warren. One of the cautions here is that we have started to pick up some changes in our populations. They seem to be adapting to these herbicides, and we're starting to lose some longevity of control, like has been seen when resistance developed further west. Your post options, we assume that all the water hemp is pretty much ALS and glyphosate resistance, but this is what it looks like if you just have ALS resistance. If you assume, okay, glyphosate still works, so if you have a non-GMO soybean program, you're going to be relying solely on PPO herbicides like Flexstar and Cobra. In Roundup Ready, you would have the option of glyphosate in the PPO, Liberty Link glufosinate, Extend both dicamba and glyphosate, Extend to Flex those two with glufosinate. Enlist E3, you would have the option of 240 glufosinate and glyphosate, and then the Liberty Link GT27 glufosinate and glyphosate. All right. these need to be applied when the plants are less than 4 inches tall, especially if it's a single component. If you're mixing 2,4-D and glufosinate in the Enlist E3, for example, you probably can go a little bigger. But this is what the situation probably more really looks like, which is most of our water hemp is ALS and glyphosate resistant. And so you can't really assume that glyphosate's going to work unless you've tested the population to make sure it still does. And so when that happens in the non-GMO and the Roundup Ready, you're relying solely on Flexstar and Cobra for your post-treatment. And that will cause that population to develop resistance fairly rapidly if you continue with that program. In the Liberty Link and Liberty Link GT27, you're relying solely on glufosinate, Extend, dicamba. In the Extended Flex, you'd have the option of dicamba glufosinate, although, as I stated earlier, I'm not sure how those are going to, what the ability is to tank mix those two products based on their application parameters and stewardship. You can mix 2,4-D and glufosinate in the Enlist or apply them by themselves. So you can see, the last two of those, you would have the greatest number of options, and then the Enlist certainly the ability to mix two to even better control in certain situations. A lot of our populations in the western side of the state, though, have developed PPO resistance in addition to ALS and glyphosate, and when that happens, you have no post options in non-GMO beans or Roundup Ready beans, and so you're out of the non-GMO business there. It doesn't really affect the rest of these compared to what we just went through. In the Liberty Link bean, you could have, for example, used a combination of Liberty with a Flexstar or something like that, and you can't do that at this point, but you really have those same options. Just some other reminders. The weed control guide will be updated again this year. The hard copy should be available sometime in January, and the PDF before that. You can get that online at the OSU Extension e-store. The PDF is cheaper, but if you buy a hard copy and have it mailed to you, you also get the PDF at no additional cost. And some local OSU Extension offices are also stocking the weed control guide. We update the rest of our fact sheets occasionally as we need to. We did update the herbicide program for non-GMO soybean fact sheet in conjunction with Purdue, so we brought that up to date. That's free. You can get it at ohioline.osu.edu or at our website, or you can always contact me to get a copy of it. The Ohio Line version is formatted for online. It doesn't really look necessarily great when it's printed, but the one that we have on our website, or I can send you, does print well and suitable for copies. And this is my information. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to contact me.